The Bible is a living and effective book, Hebrews chapter 4 and in verse 12. And one of the powerful things about the Bible is the true stories that it tells. Not only do these stories help us understand the broader Bible story that's being unfolded, but they also contain many powerful and valuable lessons for us to apply to our lives even today. Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. One such story concerns how the Israelites defeated the city of Jericho in Joshua, the 6th chapter. So the purpose of this lesson is to learn about the victory God provided his people in Jericho and lessons that are applicable to us today. Let's first begin by thinking about the context of this story before we get into Joshua chapter 6 itself. And let's understand some things that have been going on in the lead up to what happens there in Joshua chapter 6. Well, first we find out that Israel prepares to conquer the Canaan land. The generation of the Israelites who had rebelled against God by refusing to enter the promised land because they were did not have faith in God, that generation has now died. Only Joshua and Caleb remain from that generation of those who were 20 years old and older at the time of their rebellion. And God offered encouragement to Joshua in Joshua chapter 1 as Joshua was preparing now for the task of leading God's people, the Israelites, into the Canaan land that God had promised to give them. Next, we need to think for just a moment about some Transjordan settlements. Prior to Moses' death, remember Moses was the one who was leading the Israelites prior to Joshua. So prior to Moses' death, people from the tribes of Reuben and Gad were given some land on the east side of the Jordan River. And you can read about this in Deuteronomy 32 and Joshua chapter 1, verses 12 through 18, as we see that they were expected, even though they had been given this land, they were still expected to go and fight alongside the rest of the Israelites to help them conquer the Canaan land. Well, the people of Jericho, the city of Jericho, had heard about the things that Jehovah God had done for the Israelites, how he had dried up the Red Sea and how he had conquered kings across from the Jordan, Joshua chapter 2, which we'll talk about more here in just a moment. But it shows us how those things that were going on with the Transjordan settlements, how they influenced the thinking, the spirit of the people in Jericho. In Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, here is Rahab, who we'll talk about in a moment, who says, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and everyone who lives in the land is panicking because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings, you completely destroyed across the Jordan." Well, next, we see that spies were sent into Jericho. So just prior to the Israelites going into Jericho, Joshua sent 2 spies to go and scout out the land. In Joshua chapter 2 and in verse 1, he gives this instruction. Well, the spies, as this passage also shows us, stayed at Rahab's house, who was a prostitute. She demonstrated her faith that God was going to give the Israelites the city of Jericho. And so she demonstrated that faith by hiding the spies and then helping them to escape from the king as well. You read Joshua 2, verses 1 through 22. And you might note as you read through all of this that the spies also gave Rahab their word, that when they came and God gave them the city of Jericho and they conquered it, that they would save Rahab and those who were with her in her house if she would tie a scarlet cord on her window. Well, the spies then returned and they reported all that had happened during their time there. saying that the Lord had handed the city over to them. Joshua 2, verses 23 and 24. Specifically, verse 24, they told Joshua, "The Lord has handed over the entire land to us. Everyone who lives in the land is also panicking because of us." Next, we notice then Israel crosses the Jordan River. So Joshua and the Israelites left, and they came to the Jordan River in Joshua chapter 3 and in verse 1. And before crossing, Joshua said that the Lord was about to do wonders among them, verse 5. After staying for 3 days, the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant led the people into the Jordan River, and when the feet of the priests entered the river, God stopped the flow of the river. And then they stood in the middle of the river until all the Israelite people then crossed, Joshua chapter 3 and 4. And all of this then results in the Canaanites fearing. When news of how the Israelites had crossed the Red Sea and the Jordan River had reached the ears of the kings of the people of the land of Canaan, and they hear that now the Israelites have crossed the Jordan, and now they are there with them on that side of the Jordan River, they lost their heart and their courage failed. There in Joshua chapter 5 and in verse 1 tells us when all the Amorite kings across the Jordan to the west and all the Canaanite kings near the sea heard how the Lord had dried up the water of the Jordan before the Israelites. Until they had crossed over, they lost heart and their courage failed because of the Israelites. So this situation of what had just happened and how the Israelites crossed the Jordan River had this reaction, caused this response from the Canaanites. And God then continued to prepare his people after they crossed the Jordan as they were circumcised and they kept the Passover in Joshua chapter 5. So this is some of the context that now brings us to the story itself in Joshua chapter 6. The first thing we notice is that Jericho was strongly fortified. Joshua 6 and verse 1. Now, Jericho was strongly fortified because of the Israelites, no one leaving or entering. Jericho was the first city in Israel's path of conquering the Canaan land west of the Jordan River. Jericho sitting about 6 miles west to the west of the Jordan. It was a walled city with a gate and a king. And as the city heard about all that Jehovah God had done for the Israelites, the city of Jericho was fortified. It was secured and would not let anyone leave, would not let anyone enter it. Next, we see instructions that were given to Joshua in verses 2 through 5. It says, "The Lord said to Joshua, 'Look, I have handed Jericho, its kings, and its best soldiers over to you. March around the city with all the men of war, circling the city one time. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 rams' horn trumpets in front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times while the priests blow the trumpets. When there is a prolonged blast of the horn and you hear its sound, have all the troops give a mighty shout. Then the city wall will collapse, and the troops will advance, each man straight ahead.' When the time had come, God gave Joshua his orders concerning the battle plan for capturing the city of Jericho. God had now given its city, its king, and its best soldiers over to Joshua and the Israelites. God instructed that the men of war were supposed to encircle the city, marching around it one time per day for 6 days, with 7 priests carrying 7 rams' horn trumpets, in front of the Ark of the Covenant. On the seventh day, God said to march around the city 7 times while the priests blow the trumpets of ram's horns. Then, upon a prolonged blast of the horn, all the troops were to shout on the 7th day. And in doing this, God said the city's walls would collapse, and the troops then were to advance into the city. So now the plan has been set. Now, Joshua instructs the priests and the troops in verses 6 and 7. So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the Ark of the Covenant and have 7 priests carry the 7 trumpets in front of the Ark of the Lord." He said to the troops, "Move forward, march around the city, and have the armed men go ahead of the Ark of the Lord." So now it was time that Joshua passed these instructions on to the priests and on to the troops. And one can only imagine what these must have thought when they heard this battle plan for taking the city. However, they had to trust in God enough to carry out his instructions. Now, let's focus on the first 6 days in verses 8 through 14. After Joshua had spoken to the troops, 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets before the Lord moved forward and blew the trumpets. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. While the trumpets were blowing, the armed men went in front of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard went behind the ark. But Joshua had commanded the troops, "Do not shout or let your voice be heard. Don't let one word come out of your mouth until the time I say, 'Shout.' Then you are to shout." So the ark of the Lord was carried around the city, circling it once. They returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning. The priests took the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests, carrying 7 trumpets, marched in front of the ark of the Lord. While the trumpets were blowing, the armed men went in front of them, and the rear guard went behind the ark of the Lord. On the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. So upon these instructions, the people marched silently around the city with the ark of the Lord and the trumpets blowing. And after marching around the city a single time, they returned to the camp and spent the night. And they repeated this for the period of 6 days. The order of their marching around the city was as follows: armed men, followed by the 7 priests blowing the trumpets, followed by the Ark of the Covenant, followed by the rear guard. And then comes the 7th day in verses 15 through 20. Early on the 7th day they started at dawn and marched around the city 7 times in the same way. That was the only day they marched around the city 7 times. After the 7th time the priests blew the trumpets, and Joshua said to the troops, "Shout, for the Lord has given you this city." But the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and everyone with her in the house will live, because she hid the messengers we sent. But keep yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of those things, you will set apart the camp of Israel for destruction and make trouble for it. For all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's treasury. So the troops shouted, and the trumpets sounded. When they heard the blast of the trumpet, the troops gave a great shout, and the wall collapsed. The troops advanced into the city, each man straight ahead, and they captured the city. So here on the 7th day, they rose early and marched around the city in the same way, except doing so 7 times rather than 1 time. After the 7th time encircling the city, Joshua gave some final instructions to the people about what they were to do next. They were to shout because Jehovah had given the city to them. They were to recognize that the city and everything in it were set apart to Jehovah for destruction. All the silver, the gold, the bronze, and iron were dedicated to Jehovah and to be placed in his treasury. They were to keep themselves from all the things that had been set apart to Jehovah and for destruction. And if they took any of them, they would bring trouble on Israel. And they were to spare Rahab and those who were with her in her house for what she had done in hiding the spies. And then when the troops shouted and the trumpets blasted, the wall around the city collapsed by God's power, not by the great noise, but by the power of God. And then they advanced into the city. Then, as we keep reading the rest of this chapter, we see that Rahab is spared and the city is destroyed. Starting at verse 21 now. They completely destroyed everything in the city with the sword, every man and woman, both young and old, and every ox and sheep and donkey. Joshua said to the two men who had scouted the land, "Go to the prostitute's house and bring the woman out of there and all who are with her, just as you swore to her." So the young men who had scouted went in and brought out Rahab and her father, mother, brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her whole family and settled them outside the camp of Israel. They burned the city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. However, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, her father's family, and all who belonged to her, because she hid the messengers Joshua had sent to spy on Jericho, and she still lives in Israel today. At that time, Joshua imposed this curse: "The man who undertakes the rebuilding of this city, Jericho, is cursed before the Lord. He will lay its foundation at the cost of his firstborn. He will finish its gates at the cost of his youngest." And the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. As the army advanced into the city, they followed God's instructions to destroy everything and everyone. Now, sometimes we might think about that and wonder how God, a just and righteous and holy and fair God, could give such instructions. But it's important to remember that God was bringing destruction on these lands because of their wickedness. Go read Deuteronomy 9, verses 4 and 5. As for the children in this city or other cities, God knew they would often grow up and continue in the same wickedness that they had been taught, although certainly each one had free will. But it's also important to recognize they were not held responsible spiritually for the sins of their ancestors. Ezekiel 18 and verse 20 makes that very clear, though they would be physically punished. Rahab and those who were with her, her father's family and all who belonged to her, were spared according to the guarantee that the spies had given to her. And the city was burnt, and everything in it with the gold, silver, bronze, and iron then being dedicated to the Lord's treasury as had been instructed. Joshua then imposed a curse at this time upon the man who would undertake the rebuilding of the city, that doing so would cost him his firstborn. And you can see that being fulfilled in 1 Kings 16 and verse 34. And the fame of Joshua and Jehovah were spread throughout the land as news of this great victory spread. So that's the story that is recorded in the scriptures about how the Israelites defeated Jericho. But there's a lot of lessons that we can take from this story that we can apply even to our lives today. So let's think about a few of these lessons. Number one, we can learn that change can happen in a single generation. I want you to remember that these Israelites that we just read about, who were going into Jericho, going into the Canaan land to take possession of the land that God had promised to give them, that these are the ones who were under 20 years old when their ancestors had rebelled against God because they were afraid of the people in the land. Go read Numbers 13 and 14. And so this should encourage us. No matter how your ancestors chose to live, you can change and you can demonstrate true faith in God. You can learn that faithlessness results in destruction, and you can choose the way of faith. You don't have to go the same way that your ancestors have always went. Change can happen in a single generation. Another lesson that we can learn is that Jehovah God is God in heaven above and earth below. All the Canaanite nations had their own gods. Go read Deuteronomy 20 and verse 18. However, when the time came for the Israelites to come to Jericho and then to the rest of the Canaan land after, right, none of their gods could rescue them. In the same way, none of the gods we may worship and serve, whether it's the God of money or relationships or possessions or education or hobbies or whatever they are, none of the other gods that we may choose to worship and serve today will rescue us or our families in times of trouble and from the ultimate judgment of God. Only Jehovah God is the true God who is over all. Joshua 2 and verse 11, this is recognized. I believe this is Rahab talking, and she says, when we heard this, we lost heart, and everyone's courage failed because of you, for the Lord, that is Jehovah, your God, is God in heaven above and on earth below. And like Rahab, those who recognize this truth and put their trust in him will find safety in him spiritually. And those who fail to honor him as God and fully trust in him will be destroyed spiritually, like the people of Jericho were destroyed in this story. Jehovah God is God in heaven above and earth below. But here's another lesson that we learn, and that is that God always keeps his promises. The victory in Jericho marks God fulfilling his promise to Abraham. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7 says, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So when we read this and we read about what God did in bringing the Israelites into this land, we should be encouraged that God always keeps his promises. And he will keep the promises he makes us today in the pages of the New Testament scriptures. Now, although we often want God to keep his promises immediately, right, just right when he makes them, to do whatever it is that he's promised to do, this is not how it usually works. Many times, we must wait a significant period of time before God fulfills his promises. Over 400 years in the case of the promised land and the Israelites and this promise to Abram. But while we wait, we must maintain our confidence that God will keep his word, that he will act accordingly. Next, after we've learned that God always keeps his promises, we need to learn that God punishes wickedness. You know, we need to understand. I touched on it just a few moments ago, but we need to understand that the people of Jericho were not innocent people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when God chose to fulfill his promises to Israel. Rather, God had delayed fulfilling his promise about the land because he was being patient with the people of the land until their wickedness would become complete. Look in Genesis 15, verses 13 through 16. The Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in the land that does not belong to them and will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation they will return here. For the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So God was being patient with the people of the land until their wickedness would become complete. But the scriptures often teach about the wickedness of the people of the Canaan land, which of course included Jericho. Give you some different passages to read. Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 through 29. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. And Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 through 18. But let's take a moment and read Deuteronomy 12, verses 29 through 31 to get an idea here. It says, when the Lord your God annihilates the nations before you. This is Moses preparing the Israelites, this generation, to come into the Canaan land. When the Lord your God annihilates the nations before you, which you are entering to take possession of, and you drive them out and live in their land, be careful not to be ensnared by their ways after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire about their gods, asking, how did these nations worship their gods? I'll also do the same. You must not do the same to the Lord your God, because they practice every detestable act which the Lord hates for their gods. They even burn their sons and daughters in fire to their gods. Be careful to do everything I command you, not to add anything to it or take anything away from it. It should be noted that it wasn't just the Canaanites doing these things that God would have considered wickedness, but God's even warning these people through Moses that if you do these things, then you're also going to be punished. They're not going to be spared either. So God punishes wickedness. When God chooses to punish wickedness, no one can withstand his punishment. We see that with the city of Jericho. And certainly no one will be able to overpower God. When God sends Jesus for the final judgment and destruction of the ungodly, 2 Thessalonians 1, verses 8 and 9, talks about when he takes vengeance with flaming fire on those who don't know God and on those who don't obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. They will pay the penalty of eternal destruction from the Lord's presence and from his glorious strength. Next, we learn the lesson that God's instructions do not always make sense to us. I would imagine the Israelites did not envision going up to the city of Jericho and capturing them based on a plan that relied on marching around the city, blowing trumpets, and shouting. Yet that's exactly what God said to do, and the only plan that would have worked. As we think about how God tells us to live and to overcome the various challenges of our lives, God's solutions often don't sound right to us. In fact, sometimes they may even sound strange. Yet we must be assured that it is the only plan that will lead us to victory. There is sometimes a way that seems right to us, but its end is the way to death. Proverbs 14, verse 12. Only following the scriptures teaches us everything we need to know and rebukes us for what is wrong and corrects us in the way so we please God and trains us in righteousness so we may be complete and equipped for every good work. So God punishes wickedness, and that God's instructions do not always make sense to us. Next, we need to know that faith trusts God, no matter what he says and does. The Israelites trust in God enough to do whatever he said, even when doing so, could have resulted in them being killed. Think about Hebrews chapter 11. It talks about these Israelites. Hebrews 11 and verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after being marched around by the Israelites for 7 days. They trusted in God enough to do what he says. Rahab also trusted in God enough to put herself at risk in hiding the spies in verse 31. It says, by faith, Rahab the prostitute welcomed the spies in peace and didn't perish with those who disobeyed. So Rahab also trusted in God enough to do these things that were pleasing to God. And like these, faith is not an empty expression of belief in God and in his promises. Rather, true faith acts in obedience to God no matter what it is that he requires. James chapter 2 verses 24 through 26 says, you see then that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. In the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute also justified by works in receiving the messengers and sending them out by a different route? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. Next, we learn that God's purposes cannot be successfully opposed. While certainly all of the people involved in all of this story had free will, we need to see that God also had some purposes that he was carrying out. So when he decided to hand over Jericho, nobody could prevent it. Joshua 6 and verse 2. The Lord told Joshua, look, I have handed Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers over to you. Again in verse 16, this 7th time after they marched around the city, Joshua told the troops, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Nobody could oppose what God had determined would happen. Many people today, they want to maintain some sense of control over things that only God can control. But we've got to recognize that God's purposes cannot be overthrown. He will do whatever he decides to do despite anyone's efforts and anything that we might be able to might try to do to overcome it, to try to change it. God's purposes cannot be successfully opposed. Next, we learn the lesson that God must come first. Throughout the Old Testament, we read about how God wanted his people to devote the first fruits to him. That is, the first from their crops that he would bless them with. And regarding Jericho, it's interesting to me that the plunder in this first city, as they had crossed the Jordan River and coming into the Canaan land God was giving to them, the first city, they weren't to take the plunder for themselves. Instead, they were to devote it into the Lord's treasury. Joshua 6 verses 18 and 19 shows us. And I think that helps to teach us a lesson, that God's service must never be made to take a back seat in our lives to our own personal desires and our own personal gain. Just as the Israelites were expected to honor God with their first fruits, we should prioritize the things that God wants from our lives and to do in his service each day and each week. For example, whether it be assembling with the church or giving to the work of the church or studying our Bibles or praying or whatever it may be. Matthew 6 and verse 33, Jesus says, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. And then the final lesson we want to look at here today is that we must not put our confidence in earthly things. The city of Jericho may have thought that it was a pretty well fortified city when the city was being built. They may have constructed a wall that they believed would give them some kind of strong measure of security. However, they were panicking when they heard all that God had been doing through the Israelites, and that the Israelites were now approaching their city. Their Earthly sources of protection did not give them peace. Well, certainly the world offers many false senses of confidence and protection. However, only God provides the true stability that provides real confidence and protection. And it's interesting to me, in this story and in other stories, that God would often choose such unconventional ways to deliver his people to victory, so that no one could possibly make the mistake of thinking that the victory was by their own strength. And that was illustrated in Joshua 4 when they had crossed the Jordan River. And he said, in verse 24 particularly, "This is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord's hand is mighty, and so that you may always fear the Lord your God." Today, we also need to recognize this lesson, that it's not by worldly wisdom that God saves, but through a message that many consider to be foolish. Let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 1 as it demonstrates this in verse 18 through 25. It says, "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but it is the power of God to us who are being saved. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will set aside the intelligence of the intelligent. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made the world's wisdom foolish? For since in God's wisdom the world did not know God through wisdom, God was pleased to save those who believe through the foolishness of what is preached. For the Jews ask for signs, and the Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Yet to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God, because God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength." So let us always be reminded that we must not put our confidence in earthly things. As we close, we see that God delivered his people Israel to a great victory over Jericho in Joshua chapter 6. And this began the conquest of the promised land west of the Jordan River that would continue, as you can read about throughout the book of Joshua. And we can learn some great lessons from this story that are relevant to pleasing God even to this day. Let us never forget these lessons, and let us make the proper applications of them.